Welcome to Coach Bennett's podcast, where every run has a purpose, where kindness is hardcore, where this is about running, and this is not about running, where every starting line is a finish line in disguise, where rambling still gets you where you need to be, where pineapple will never ruin your pizza, and the sodas, adult and not adult kind, are always cold, and where there is room on the starting line for everybody. I'm Coach Bennett. Thank you for letting me be a part of your day. Let's get started. Welcome to episode 93 of Coach Bennett's podcast. That's right, we are only a few episodes away from the century mark, which is bonkers to me. I can't believe that we are that close to the 100th episode. So I'm going to ask you right off the bat, if you have ideas for what a special 100th episode could be, send them my way. All right, let me know what you think the 100th episode should be. And maybe, who knows, maybe it will be your idea that makes episode 100 so special. But this one I think is really special too, this episode 93. And I'll tell you where it came from. Well, I was a senior in high school. I didn't know if I wanted to actually give you the details. You can do the math on this. In 1993. And at that point, I think I had finally just admitted that I love this sport, that I wanted to be a part of this sport. I was still a lazy dude, but I had this struggle for a long time admitting how much this sport meant to me. And there was a lot that went into it, and maybe there'll be a podcast about my story and how I got into the sport. But for now, suffice to say, I was not comfortable admitting that I loved the sport. But by the fall of 93, I think it had become pretty obvious, and I was at least able to admit that it was very, very important to me. And as I thought about that, I started to think back like, well, where did this start? You know, where did this relationship with running start for me? And obviously it goes back to just, getting up off the floor, learning how to crawl, learning how to toddle, and then running and the joy that comes with that, and then playing with my older sister and older brothers and younger brother, and obviously running around in the backyard and the joy associated with that. And then being able to be a part of, teams for the first time, regardless of the sport, when you were really, really having the most fun. If you think back to it, it was usually when you were running, when you were moving. So there's a lot of that. But I started to think, was there a moment where the sport kind of first entered the picture? And there was. And I'm going to tell you that story. I'm going to tell you my first memory of the sport of running being something that drew my attention, that gave me butterflies, that got me fired up, that inspired me. And I was little. I was 8 years old, and it was the 1984 Los Angeles Olympic Games. And I was just at that age where sports was really becoming a part of my life. I was starting to pay attention to some pro sports, at least for the first time. It had always been on in the background, but I was starting to watch it a little bit. And I remember during the opening ceremonies, which blew my mind as a little kid, because there was actually one moment where a dude in a jetpack flies into the stadium, into the Coliseum. You're 8 years old and you're infatuated with like Star Wars, and you're watching on TV somebody flying into the stadium in a frickin' jetpack. It was crazy. And during the opening ceremonies, when they have the march, the parade of nations, my oldest brother, Bobby, was telling me who the best athletes were at this Olympic Games. And I'll tell you what, he knew what was up, because he mentioned 3 athletes, just 3. He mentioned Sebastian Coe, who was going to be running the 800 meters and the 1500 meters for Great Britain. He mentioned Michael Jordan, who was on the men's basketball team for the United States, still a college kid. And he mentioned Joan Benoit, who was going to run the marathon. So I'll just let you know ahead of time, I was into everything, though. So I had these athletes kind of in the back of my mind, but I was into every sport. I was into rowing and the crew. I was into the volleyball. I was into swimming and the diving. I was into everything. I was into the gymnastics. It was just bliss for 2 weeks. All I did all day long was either watch the Olympics or go outside and play Olympics. That's what I did. And I'll actually tell you something ridiculous that I did, which I obviously was not the brightest kid in the world. I was watching the high jump, and I went outside, and there was a low branch on a tree, and I thought, I'm going to high jump over this branch. So I did. The problem was there was no mat, so I just fell on my back on the ground and had the wind knocked out of me, and I was lying there just thinking, I'm never going to breathe again. And I also realized I'm a complete idiot. But anyway, the point is, I would go outside and I would do the long jump, and we would be playing basketball together with the neighborhood kids, and we were having races, and it was so great to just be totally in on the Olympics. And at that point, LA was as far away as I could imagine. Like, the West Coast was I'd never been. In fact, I wouldn't visit the West Coast for another decade. It just didn't happen as often. People travel so much more now. And California, to me, was a magical place. It was Beach Boys songs and surfer movies, and it was magical. So everything about the 1984 Olympics just hit right with me. Now, I'm going to tell you the story about one particular day. I came downstairs, and I went into the room that had our TV, and my mom had been watching and, just kind of bouncing in, bouncing out. The TV was on because the Olympics were on, and it was people running on the roads. And I watched it for, a minute or two. It was a big group of women running, and then I went outside, played for a little bit. I came in, and sure enough, the TV's still on, and it's still on this race on the roads. These women running. And I think I knew it was the marathon. I don't think I really could contextualize what 26.2 miles, 42.2K meant. I know I wasn't aware of how conditions played a part. Obviously, running a marathon is very, very difficult. Running a marathon in LA can be extremely difficult if the weather does not cooperate, and I didn't find out till many years later that the weather had not cooperated. It eventually reaches, I think, a high of around 85 degrees Fahrenheit, which is hot. But I was kind of loosely paying attention to what was going on, and obviously being an American, I kind of noticed the USA jerseys, and having a dad who was very into running, and a sister that was very into running, and a brother that was very into running. Some of the names of the athletes had been bouncing around the house while I was growing up. Great names like Rosa Moda of Portugal, Greta Weitz of Norway, Ingrid Christensen of Norway as well. These were athletes that I had heard of because they were some of the rock stars of track and field and road running, the marathon. And this field was really epic. So I knew right off the bat, these are big time rock star runners. And then there was Joan Benoit as well. And I know that name. And I remember she had on a white kind of like painter's hat on. So she kind of stood out amongst this field. But it's a long race, I could tell that. So I was coming in and coming out, and the race was going on. And eventually I came back in. I don't know how many minutes into the race it must have been, probably less than half an hour. And I noticed that Joan Benoit was in the lead, which was really cool. So I watched it for a little bit, and I heard the commentators talking. And it's funny, years later, the things that you think you remembered, but obviously maybe you're only 8 years old, maybe you didn't hear them correctly. I felt like the announcers were saying what she was doing didn't make sense, and that she probably had set herself up for something really rough, because she took the lead about 5K into the race. So this is a 42K plus race, and she took the lead
at 5K, which means, again, quick maths, she's got about 37K left in the race, 23 miles roughly, where she's going to be out there up front alone. Now, if you've run any kind of a race, you know that leading is more taxing in so many different ways than following. But interestingly enough, she said one of the reasons why she took the lead was she felt like she wasn't running her race. She felt like she was running other women's races, not hers, not Joni's race. So she decided to go. So she had made a choice, obviously, that, you know what, maybe it's more taxing. Maybe it's harder to lead. But it's also taxing and hard when you're not running the way that feels natural to you. So she decided, I'm going to take it. I'm going to take the lead. And even I knew at 8 years of age, having no idea how long a marathon was, having really no concept of what it meant to lead a race, because I'm sure at that point I had never led a race before, just what she was taking on. But I knew she was taking something on, that what she was doing was difficult, it was hard, it was gutsy, it was brave, it was courageous. And I think it's important to just mention right here, yes, little kids know what those things are. Little kids know exactly what those things are. In fact, maybe little kids know what it means to be brave and courageous more than adults do sometimes, or maybe all the time. Anyway, the point is, I'm watching this. I know she's throwing down. She's doing something badass. And I leave. I go outside and I play. And I must have been gone for a while, because when I came back in, she was all alone. And I noticed something interesting. There seemed to be more people out on the streets. There seemed to be bigger crowds. And they all seemed to have these big smiles on their face. And I couldn't help smiling either, as I just watched her roll, as I just watched her run, as I just watched her lead. And every once in a while they would cut back to the pack, and you could see that the pack is starting to think, do we need to chase her down? And at least initially, up to this point, they had decided to let her go. Now, I'm going to give you a little background on why they probably let her go and continued to let her pull away. Well, you have to qualify to make the U.S. Olympic team in the marathon by placing top 3 in the Olympic trials. Now, 10 days before the U.S. Olympic trials, which took place in March, the marathon took place, the Olympic marathon took place in August. So you're looking at having around 4.5 months maybe between the Olympic trials and the Olympics. Now, 10 days before the Olympic trials, Joan Benoit had surgery, arthroscopic surgery on her knee. She had been out on a long run. She felt something kind of pop in her knee, and she knew something was wrong. And what she found out was she was going to have something called a plica removed from her knee. So she had arthroscopic surgery on her knee 10 days before the Olympic trials. Now, I actually had an issue with the plica in my knee when I was in college. It was my sophomore year. And same thing, I was running, I was actually screwing around, but I felt a pop. And it shut down my entire outdoor track season. I had to redshirt. I couldn't run. So the fact that she went and had arthroscopic surgery to deal with this 10 days before the Olympic trials, then competed in the Olympic trials, won the Olympic trials. Now, through all of this, obviously, she's got a tender knee and starts to develop some hamstring issues, as you can imagine, because the form is being thrown off. She's probably rushing through some of the training. So the buildup to the Olympics was not ideal. And the other athletes knew that she had had surgery before the Olympic trials. They knew she was having other issues. They knew her training was not up to the standards that she would have liked. Because Joni was known. Joni was a rock star. Joni had won Boston. She was one of the world's best marathoners. But guess what? The other world's best marathoners were in the race. And their training did not involve having to deal with arthroscopic surgery and a bum hamstring like Joni's did. So they thought she did not have the endurance, the strength, the miles, meters, minutes under her belt to do what she was trying to do. I imagine what they thought was, she's trying to make a play to get away or throw us off our race plans. We're not going to do it. She's not ready. She can't get away. And nobody at a major marathon against such a stacked field is going to think, I can do this alone for 23 miles. So she took off. Now, a couple little historical things I just want to throw in here to kind of give you the context, all right? This was the first women's marathon in 1984 in the Olympic Games. Now, that's not that long ago. I was a beautiful, charming, adorable little kid when this happened. So we're not talking, this is hundreds of years ago when the women's marathon was first in the Olympic Games. Oh no, it was not that long ago. All right. Prince was the biggest artist in the world alongside people like Madonna and Bruce Springsteen. All right. Like, you know these names. They're rocking, they're singing, they're having a good time. This was not that long ago. Live Aid is less than a year away. That's right. Freddie Mercury getting on the stage and throwing down at Wembley. That was less than a year away. So this is not that long ago. So it's wild to think that there wasn't a women's marathon until 1984. But let me tell you this. I'm going to take you back to 1928, the Olympic Games in Amsterdam. This was the first year that they added an 800 for the women at the Olympic Games. At the time, individual events in track and field, there was a 100 and an 800 on the track. That was it. So the 800 was the longest event the women were able to run at the Olympic Games. And it was an epic event. There was a world record set in the final. It was an amazing race. And at the end, if you know anything about the 800, which is a brutal event, it's like the longest sprint, the shortest distance event. You're basically redlining almost the entire way. And at the end of an 800, a great 800, athletes oftentimes are sprawled on the ground. And that's what the women were. They were tired. They were fatigued. They just ran in the greatest women's 800 of all time at the Olympic Games. But that's not how it was presented in the press in the preceding days. They presented it as unfeminine. They thought it was a travesty that women were allowed to run the 800, that it was too far for them to run, that they shouldn't have been put in this position. They wrote that many of the women didn't even finish the race, which was not true. It was absolutely not true. And there was a backlash. There was a backlash against the women's 800 in the Olympics in 1928. So it was taken away. It was removed from the Olympic schedule and wasn't even returned to the Olympic schedule until 1960. That's right, 32 years later. That's when the 800 was added back to the Olympics and became the longest event the women could race at the Olympics again. 1960. The 1500 wasn't even added until 1972. The 10K was added in 1988. And the 5K wasn't added until 1996. So when you wrap your head around some of these dates, that it wasn't until 1972 that they added the 15 and that became the longest event that the women were racing. The men were racing the 5. The men were racing the 10K. The men were racing the marathon. But the women could only go up to the 1500. So I think it's important to have that context and how big a deal it was to have the marathon added in 1984. So there's a lot on the line here, okay? And I think it's important for what I'm going to talk about a little bit later to have the context of what happened in 1928 and the reaction, especially in the press, to women racing in 800 the way it's supposed to be raced and feeling the way you're supposed to feel after an 800. So just park that somewhere because we'll come back to it. So anyway, I'm 8 years old. I'm running in. I'm running out. And eventually I come in and I notice, oh, we're getting close because I can hear it in the announcers' voices that this is probably going to happen. She may pull it off. Now, keep in mind, this is 2.5 hours of me going in the house, out of the house, in the house, out of the house. My mom is now on the couch, firmly parked there, watching this because this is exciting. This is amazing. You're going to have this young runner from Maine, which is in the northeast of the United States, potentially become the first winner of the marathon at the Olympics for women. Incredible. And this is the thing. The temperatures are hot. You can tell. The sun has been relentless. Like I mentioned, it got up to about 85 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, she's from Maine, which is in the Northeast, as I mentioned. A lot of people think, oh, Maine, it must be cold. No, in the summer, Maine can get hot. And more importantly, Maine can get really humid. So she dealt with some really tough conditions leading up to the Olympics because LA was going to be hot. She was running in heat and humidity. Okay, so that was a benefit she felt. That was a strength that she had. It's interesting how people can look at their conditions that they run in as weaknesses or strengths, and yet the conditions don't change. She saw a hot and humid summer in Maine, not as a weakness, but as a strength. And it paid off because you had, like I mentioned, Rosa Motas in the race from Portugal. She was known as a great marathoner in the heat. Now, as she's getting closer to the stadium, let's get back to the race. You know, Joni has mentioned since this race that she had no idea if anyone was going to be at the LA Coliseum because it was going to finish at the LA Coliseum where she was going to have to run a straightaway and a full lap. So 500 meters on the track at the Coliseum. She thought, you know, we've never had a women's marathon before. I didn't know if people were going to care, but you could tell from the footage that more and more people were coming out to the streets to cheer. There was more excitement on the roads. And it's because, think about it, for 2.5+ hours, she's been in the lead. There is this unbelievable excitement and this energy, but she's thinking, you know, we could finish here and there could just be family and friends. Now, if you watch the footage, as she runs outside of the LA Coliseum, you'll see people at the topmost section outside standing because it was standing room only. There were close to 80,000 people waiting for her inside the Coliseum, waiting for the competitors of the first women's marathon in the Los Angeles Olympic Games. And as she makes this turn into the Coliseum, she's going to enter into a tunnel. And she has this like moment of clarity where she's in the tunnel, in the darkness, where she understands that her life's about to change. She's got about 20 seconds maybe until she runs out of the tunnel and into the Coliseum. And she asks herself a question. She says, am I strong enough to carry the torch they're about to give me? Because she knew how historically important this moment was to win the first women's marathon at the Olympic Games. And I just always found that incredible because she's been leading this incredible field of runners, mile after mile, meter after meter, minute after minute. For 2+ hours, she's been in the lead, beating the world's best marathoners. Can I carry this torch? And she answers, yes, I've got the strength to do it. And as she runs out of this dark tunnel, she enters into this massive explosion of light. The sun is shining in Los Angeles, and as this solitary runner leaves the tunnel, 80,000 fans explode in cheers. And she runs her last lap and crosses the finish line, running a time of 2:24:52. And I watched it, and I saw her cross the line, and I remember she went over, and she was given a flag, I think it was tied to like a broomstick, and she's doing her victory lap, and I ran straight outside, and I'm cheering, and I'm yelling to my friends and the neighbors that, you know, Joan Benoit just won the marathon, Joan Benoit just won the marathon. I don't even know what's going on. I don't know how long the marathon is. I didn't know what her time was. I just knew that she won, and I was running around and probably did a few races. And as I come back in, full of excitement, crashing through the door, I see my mom is now moved from the couch to the floor. She's kind of on her knees and she's watching the TV, and something's off. I can tell immediately. Kids know when something is off. And I notice my mom's crying and she's watching the TV. And I suddenly look up and I see that there's an athlete that is staggering. She's obviously on her last lap, but she's having a struggle. She's struggling just to walk. And there are 2 individuals on each side of her. And I hear my mom saying, why won't anyone help her? And I realized later that those 2 individuals were doctors. And I had read later that they had noticed she was still perspiring. So they felt that she was safe to continue, but there was no doubt she was severely, severely dehydrated. The athlete, Swiss athlete, was named Gabriela Andersen-Scheiss, and it took her, I believe, around 5 minutes to complete this final lap, her last lap of the marathon. Now, at the time in 1984, they allowed 5 water stations, only 5, over the course of this race. Keep in mind, I told you, it got up to 85 degrees. She missed the last water station, and she was probably already suffering from dehydration. Missing this last water station really just tipped her over the edge, and by the time she made it to the LA Coliseum, she was unable to run. And I imagine she was starting to see, tunnel vision was getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and she was staggering, but she was moving, and she was trying to make her way to the finish line, to the end of this marathon. Now, I want you to think back to 1928, which is why I brought it up. I want you to think back to Amsterdam, 1928, Women's 800. I want you to think about that incredible race, those women that ran, and at the time, probably the best 800 of all time, collapsing at the end of the race because they had spent themselves, because they had given all they had to the race and to the competition. And I want you to think about the reaction from some in the crowd, and especially from those sports writers who blasted it and said this is why women should not compete at races of 800 meters. Now go to 1984. We just had Joan Benoit run 2:24 for the marathon with 80,000 people cheering. And now you've got an athlete coming in 20 minutes later, taking 5 minutes to finish her last lap, struggling to make it to the finish line. 30 meters to go. 20 meters to go, 10 meters to go. The doctor's closing in on her because it looks as if she's going to collapse at any moment. What is the crowd going to do? What is the reaction going to be? And as she crosses the finish line and falls into the arms of these doctors, the crowd cheers because they know they saw something powerful. They know they saw something that was Olympic in its effort. And I just think it's important sometimes to give context to these moments, how powerful they are. Because I'll tell you what, that day, watching that marathon, and not just Joni's win, but Gabriela Andersen-Scheiss's win, running 2:48.42, 24 minutes behind Joni. Those 2 races are why I'm still in this sport. Because at 8, I realized that's something I want to be about. That's the type of passion I want in my life. That's the type of strength I want to be around. And I struggled myself to stay in this sport, but something kept me in it. And I think this race was one of the most important things that kept me in this sport. And I'm going to give you just one more thing I want to say about Gabriela Andersen-Scheiss's time, that 2:48, going through severe dehydration. Well, her time would have won the first 4 Olympic marathons. Yeah. Missing a water station, 85-degree temperatures, suffering through severe dehydration, 15 minutes off her PB. She would have won the first 4 men's Olympic marathons. So, just something to think about. But yeah, I felt like telling you that story. And I'm going to put a video up of a video that I made years and years and years ago for younger athletes that I was working with about Joni's win. It's called The First Gold. I wanted the younger athletes I was working with to love their sport. I wanted them to be fans of the sport. I wanted them to realize that we have these great stories, these great characters, and these great races that they're a part of. They're not apart from. They're a part of. Because if you're a part of this sport, then you're a part of all of it. It's yours. And I wanted them to experience, in a small way, maybe, what I experienced. So I'm going to put that video up, and if I can find a great link to Gabriela Andersen-Scheiss's story, I'll put that up there too. So this was a little bit of some story time for episode 93. And like I said, I just thought back to being a senior in high school and finally realizing, you know what? This matters to me. And one of the reasons why it matters to me is because I was inspired and I was motivated by these 2 women racing back in 1984. So that's the show. That's the episode. And as always, thank you for listening to the show. Thank you for following and subscribing to the show. Thank you for rating and reviewing the show. If you have not already, please do. And until the next show, take care of yourself. Take care of each other. I'll meet you on the next starting line. Thank you so much for listening to Coach Bennett's podcast today. And if you haven't already subscribed or set yourself as a follower to the podcast, I really hope you would. And make sure you check out the show notes, because in those show notes, you're going to find a link to Coach Bennett's newsletter and all the social media sites I'm on, like Instagram and Threads and Cameo and Blue Sky and Nope, not on that one anymore. So all the ones I am on, you're going to find it in the show notes, so check that out as well. And as always, thank you again for listening to Coach Bennett's podcast. Until next time, you keep taking care of yourself and each other.